Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent. On this episode, we are going to be reflecting on the last 10 years of the Habitat Conservation Plan with Melani Howard from the City of San Marcos and Mark Enders from the City of New Braunfels. As you all may know, the EAHCP, also known as the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan, defines how we protect federally listed species that live in the Edwards Aquifer and the Comal and San Marcos Springs. This program's incidental take permit, which is a permit issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act to protect the species identified by the Act, was granted to the Edwards Aquifer Authority, the City of San Marcos, the City of New Braunfels, Texas State University, and the City of San Antonio, acting by and through the San Antonio Water System, collectively known as the EAHCP permittees, to protect federally listed species from specific activities and covered activities, like groundwater pumping.
Melani and Mark, we're glad to have you here today to discuss the successes of the EAHCP, but before we get into that, can we have you all give a brief overview of your roles on the EAHCP? Melani, let's start with you.
Our roles, Mark's and my roles, are very similar. We implement the HCP for our cities, Mark for New Braunfels and mine for the City of San Marcos and Texas State University. In that, Texas State is at the headwaters, and then City of San Marcos is downstream, so it made sense to combine those two. And so in doing so, I take the measures that are in the HCP. There are many measures, some of which are funded, some are unfunded. And for the funded measures, we've hired contractors to implement the majority of those. And so I oversee the contractors, just make sure that the work is being done, envisioning where it needs to go next, and preparing for those things, preparing the myriad of reports and PowerPoint presentations for the EAA, and just keep the ball rolling, the contracting, the finances, everything between the city, and pretty much the liaison between the city, university, and the EAA in the implementation of the HCP.
Now, Melani, you've been involved in the EAHCP for a long, long time, right? And when did you start, or were you there from the beginning?
I was there from the beginning. I've been working for the City of San Marcos, so I was hired in 1996, before a lot of people were born. And at that time, I was hired because the City of San Marcos and Texas State wanted an HCP of their own. They knew they needed to cover take from recreation and take from the various things that the university does on Spring Lake. Mm-hmm. So they wanted it. And so I was hired to write that, which I did. And it was submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service. But Fish and Wildlife Service had a hidden agenda. They wanted a regional HCP, and they knew it was coming. So they kind of stalled the work that I did, which is fine because eventually it rolled into the regional HCP. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I went through the whole 4 years of the ERIP, Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program. So that was the stakeholder group that started off on two diverse sides and ended up working together and putting together this HCP.
Yeah, that was a group of, you mentioned diverse, so we had interests for the agricultural side, recreational interests, municipalities, all trying to agree on what to do. I imagine that was a long time coming and some tense arguments.
Yes, it was the second attempt. So there was a first attempt, and I don't remember what year that was, but it was led by Fish and Wildlife, and there was a small group of stakeholders. It was more formalized, not such a big program, and they just couldn't reach consensus on anything. And so that effort failed. And that's why they came in with the ERIP program, which is an intense, long-term program where everybody faces each other at least once a month and sometimes more often to just work through all the problems. And that obviously really worked well.
Mm-hmm. And now, Mark, you represent City of New Braunfels in a similar role. Anything to add?
Sure, there's a lot of overlap with what Melani mentioned, but essentially my role is to implement the habitat protection measures that are listed out in the HCP, to implement those within the Comal River system. Essentially all those habitat protection measures are aimed at maintaining and improving habitat for for the endangered species that live within the Comal River system. So my role is, lining out or preparing the work plans for the next year to be implemented, and then working with our various contractors to make sure that they're managing and implementing those projects accurately and per the work plans that we put together. As Melanie mentioned, there's a lot of administration too. I wish that I was the one out there in the river every day doing the restoration work, But there's a lot of administration, not just managing contracts and overseeing contractors, but as y'all know, there's a lot of transparency through the HCP. So we prepare work plans. Those work plans are reviewed with some of the EAA's HCP staff, and then we present those work plans to the science committee, the stakeholder committee, the implementing committee, and so there's a lot of transparency on what we're doing in both of the river systems through the HCP.
Well, yes, I mean, all of us would want to be out there in the river, counting fountain darters and doing the fun stuff, but what you do is just as important, really, to keep the program on track. To give our listeners a background of these two systems, so Melanie with the San Marcos Springs and Mark with the Comal Springs, the Comal Springs itself is the largest spring system in Texas, as well as the southwestern United States. Its springs come from the Edwards Aquifer and are located mainly in Landa Park in New Braunfels. It's kind of the downtown area or near there. The system is comprised of 4 major spring runs that feed into Landa Lake and a larger number of smaller springs that are present within the lake. The springs create the largest mean discharge, so average discharge of any spring in the southwestern United States, and ultimately the headwaters of the Comal River, which is also the shortest river in Texas. The system exhibits near constant temperatures at about 74 degrees, and over the years, extensive development along the lake and riverbanks, channel modification, and the natural variability of the springs has resulted in some biological impact. All right, Mark, can you share with us a brief description of the habitat conservation measures in New Braunfels that y'all been working with to fulfill over time? What it's taken to work towards the goal, staff, hours, equipment, etc., and the status of these measures today?
Sure, and it's hard to know where to start. There's been a lot of work that's been done over the last 10 years in both the Comal River system and the San Marcos River system. Starting with the submerged aquatic vegetation restoration, we've made huge strides with basically managing non-native aquatic vegetation within the bottom of Landa Lake and the Comal River, and promoting the establishment of native aquatic plants within Landa Lake and Comal River.
So is that when you have like the scuba divers go down there and plant the plants, right? I've seen that in action.
It is, yeah, and a lot of this work is out of the view from the general public because the work is occurring on the bottom of the lake or the river.
Yeah.
It's definitely a challenging work environment. Yeah, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're removing non-native plant species. They're propagating and planting the native plant species that provide better habitat for the fountain darter. It's always 74 degrees or 72 degrees in San Marcos, and so that's just perfect conditions for aquatic vegetation growth. So that's why when you look out over the pier from Landa Lake, you can see it's just chock full of aquatic vegetation. It's that same vegetation that the fountain darter thrives in. So we've made huge advances in the SAV restoration, as well as the stream zone or the riparian zone along Landa Lake and the Comal River. So Brent, you had mentioned, there's been a lot of alterations through history of these aquatic ecosystems and riparian zones. And so, back in the day, there was a lot of non-native plants that were introduced to both spring systems, and some of those non-natives have flourished and even displaced the native species. So that's in the case of the aquatic vegetation, but also the stream zone, the riparian vegetation, to where there was large swaths of riverbank that were dominated by these non-native species. So similar to the aquatic vegetation restoration, we came in and basically began to take out or remove non-native vegetation and establish native plants along the stream bank, which those native plants typically have a stronger root system and provide more bank stability. Aside from that, we've also done big engineered bank stabilization projects. One project was on the old channel of the river to basically stabilize an eroding bank and provide that good habitat, I guess, for the fountain darter within the old channel of the river.
Where is that, like, in reference to, is that in Landa Park, or is that kind of in a different area?
It is. It's on the kind of on the margins of Landa Park, and it flows through the upper portions of the old channel are through the Landa Park golf course.
Okay, I see.
And then the lower portions are through the golf course and Schlitterbahn. So
Oh, nice.
really,
Nice.
it's the original channel of the Comal River. Most people, unless you're a golfer or at Schlitterbahn, you really don't know it's there. Most people are attracted to what we call the new channel, and that's where a lot of the recreation occurs. So, but that old channel is important because it's off limits to recreation, and so it's somewhat of a refuge for the aquatic vegetation that we're planting and for the fountain darter. So it's somewhat protected against flood pulses and recreation. We've also, through the EAHCP, installed a set of culvert gates, what we call the flow split, that allows us to govern or direct flow from the Comal Springs and Land Lake into the old channel, so we can regulate the flow rates that go in and provide the good flow conditions that are conducive to aquatic vegetation growth and the habitat for a fountain darter.
Wow.
Yeah, so to give our listeners kind of a more visualization here, Landa Park is basically surrounded by development. You mentioned the golf course, the neighborhood, and recreational users. So you all had to contend with all these different obstacles to kind of restore the springs to what they might have been originally, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're definitely right smack in the middle of an urban environment. A lot of the area immediately around the Comal River has already been developed. Certainly New Braunfels is growing like crazy, but the area immediately adjacent to the river and throughout most of the watershed has really been developed for some time. But yeah, certainly trying to undo some of those negative impacts or harm that I guess some of the early settlers of New Braunfels had kind of caused, probably unknowingly to the river system as they kind of tried to harness the river's power for human use, not necessarily for, preservation of fountain darter and the habitat of the endangered species. So yeah, definitely a lot of the work we do is trying to mitigate some of the impacts, that our predecessors have caused on the river system.
And have you seen successes? Have the numbers increased based on the biological assessments for the species?
That's hard to say. The numbers are at least staying stable, at least the fountain darter populations. There's, always so many variables at play when you're looking at that data. Whether you're looking at flow conditions, flood conditions, drought, there's so many different variables at play. But all the data I've seen, the biological data, looks like the species populations are staying consistent.
The fountain darter population in both spring systems has always been pretty high. It's an abundant species. And so I think the overarching concern is the fact that they're endemic to our systems. And so ensuring through the EAHCP measures that their habitat, the fountain darter habitat, is as high as quality as we can get it is really important to offset maybe during the drought times when flows do drop and habitat can degrade, that we can offset that.
Yeah.
It's like a higher volume of them present helps when in times of drought or times of low flow or things like that. I see.
That's a really good point, Melanie. I think there's a big misconception that an endangered species, people always think that means that their numbers are limited and they're almost, extinct. But it can also be that their habitat is extremely limited. So there may be hundreds of thousands of fountain darters, but they're isolated to these two areas of these springs.
And Mark, I want to ask you a quick question. I know you mentioned native and non-native species or invasive species. Can you give a few examples of some of those that occur in the Comal River Springs?
Sure. If we're talking about riparian zone, so stream bank species that grow on the banks of Land Lake and Comal River, the non-native species that were abundant and even dominant in some areas were Chinaberry, Chinese tallow, elephant ears, and ligustrum. So those are the main four. I think those same species kind of dominated areas of the San Marcos River system as well.
I see, okay.
And so we're removing those, and as we remove those, we're planting native, grasses, muley grasses, big blue stem, bushy blue stem, sycamore trees, cypress trees. So a lot of the native species that are native to the Comal River system, and we're planting those and promoting the growth of those species.
It's so pretty because I feel like a few years ago, before I think y'all did the riparian restoration along one of the spring runs, it was I feel like it was more like you could kind of go up to the springs, but now you see all of the vegetation growing, right? Along those areas.
Yeah, and part of the, especially with the elephant ears and, well, I guess with all the non-native species, they really do form really dense clusters that really dominate certain areas of stream bank. They shade out, the stream environment. They shade out other plants, so they really don't promote, I guess, a diversity of native plant species. They tend to just dominate. You'll see a monoculture of a certain non-native species that just dominate area and really their growth habit gets out of control.
So would you say, I guess something else we kind of wanted to touch on is from the inception of the HCP and kind of the measures that y'all have worked towards until now, what are like some of the highlights, I guess, of things that you've seen happen in the Comal Springs and the Comal River?
Sure, definitely the change of the aquatic vegetation in Land O'Lake and the Comal River has gone from being dominated by non-native species, non-native aquatic vegetation, to one of native vegetation. Again, that the fountain darter typically thrives in more than the non-native species. So that's been a huge transformation, as well as the riverbanks, especially around Land O'Lake. There's been a transformation from those non-native species that we've mentioned to ones of native dominated species. There's been a huge effort with the non-native animal species removal program. Okay. So this is aimed at removing tilapia, sailfin catfish, and nutria from the Comal River system. All of those species cause negative impacts to the fountain darter and the endangered species we're trying to protect. So just some numbers offhand is we have removed over 10,000 non-native fish species from Land O'Lake since 2013. And so when we look at those numbers and the impacts that those species have on the endangered species we're trying to protect, it's just a huge change from what we had before the HCP started.
Mark, I would add that one of the best examples of a success of the EAHCP is just that the springs have kept flowing this whole time, despite some record droughts, including the 2011 drought, which was one of the hottest and driest summers on record. The springs continued to flow, and I think a big part of that had to do with the EAHCP.
Agreed, and there's only so much. A critical piece of that habitat for the endangered species is the flow portion. Melanie and I can only do so much with habitat improvements, but if the flow is not there, it's hard for the species to thrive. And so certainly 2011, even 2014, after the HCP started, we definitely got into a drought period. Luckily, we had some recovering rains that brought spring flow levels back up. But spring flow got really low, and it really tested, I guess, some of that habitat, and certainly those spring flow protection measures that are in place through the EAA and the HCP help to provide that important spring flow to the systems.
Well, thanks, Marks, for sharing that overview of the conservation measures in New Braunfels. As we move on to learning about the measures in San Marcos, it's important to note that the San Marcos Springs ecosystem is the second largest in Texas and has the most environmental stability and flow reliability of any spring systems in the southwestern United States. This spring system has never stopped flowing in recorded history. The stability of its spring flow helps support the rare flora and fauna found in Spring Lake and in the San Marcos River. Temperatures remain nearly constant year-round at a 70-degree Fahrenheit temperature, and the biological uniqueness of high degree of endemism found in Spring Lake and in the upper San Marcos River can be attributed to its stable temperatures and clear water. Along the San Marcos River, construction and residential development continue to occur, although historically to a lesser degree than along the Comal River. Melanie, like Mark mentioned earlier with some of the successes of the HCP in New Braunfels, can you share with us a brief description of the habitat conservation measures in San Marcos that you all have been working to fulfill over time, and the work that it's taken to fulfill the goal and the status of these measures today?
So because our measures are so similar, Mark covered the in-stream measures and the riparian work, which I could just say, yes, we're doing the same thing in San Marcos with also a high degree of success. One of the areas that both of us have branched out into is water quality. The measure is called impervious cover something, but it is about water quality. That's the point of the measure, is that we can protect habitat, but if the quality of the water is not good, that's detrimental to habitat as well. And of course, the spring flow measures are about quantity, so that's covered with other measures that are implemented by SAWS. So for water quality, what we've done, we had about $5 million dedicated to that for this first portion of the ITP. And so we took that, knowing $5 million sounds like a lot, but it doesn't go very far. And we decided to focus on one of the smallest watersheds of the San Marcos River. It's the second tributary, it's Sesame Creek. It's a watershed that has a lot of impervious cover. So it's about 38% impervious cover, which is a lot when you know that degradation begins at 10%. And so Sesame Creek, and it's in a highly contour, very steep watershed. So it's sending, with every major rain event, it sent a lot of sediment into San Marcos River. It covered one of our species in the San Marcos River that's unique to only the San Marcos River, is the Texas wild rice. And it would just bury stands of Texas wild rice. So that was our focus. We have spent years designing the project. We began the project about 6 months ago, and the first phase is to remove. So there are wastewater lines that were put in decades and decades ago. And they were put in underneath the creek. Well, now there's been so much erosion that the active wastewater lines are suspended over the creek. So step one is to, and this is the city's partnership, and the city's paying for this part of the project. They are cutting and plugging those lines, and then they're going to bore new lines underneath. So that's wonderful. That's step one. And then in a couple of months, we're going to move into phase one. So we're restoring half of the creek, bringing it into equilibrium so it can handle the amount of stormwater runoff it's receiving without a lot of erosion.
And does that mean like planting Texas wild rice, or what is that?
No, this is an ephemeral creek, so it gets rain, it gets water in it only when it's been raining.
Yes.
So a stormwater creek of sorts, but it's just that it's going to then have good quality water flow going into the San Marcos River. And so the stands of wild rice and fountain darter habitat will be protected in the San Marcos River.
So it's a stream bank restoration and some stormwater best management practices, that sort of thing.
So some of these projects, like you just mentioned, it takes years to actually start to begin them, like the one you just mentioned. It took years, and then now you're finally starting it.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly. And we do the Plecostomus tilapia removal as well, also some invasive snails. And to do all these measures, over the years, I've worked with 8 different contractors. And I think most of the contractors Mark has also used. We found what's exciting is we have found over time that the contractors that are local, that love the spring systems, are really the ones that do the best work for us. And so that's who we've kind of both ended up with. And they do a fantastic job.
What about, is the armored catfish is removed in San Marcos, right?
Correct. Same. He has a sail fin.
Sail fin.
Okay.
And we have just the verticulated, I think.
Which one is the one that they do the spear fishing to get it?
Both of them.
Okay, really?
And these are the algae eaters that you typically see on the wall of your fish tank.
Okay.
But much larger.
Much larger, yeah.
Yes, so this is a good opportunity to do the take-home message. And education is also one of our unfunded measures that we do continuously. And that's if you have to buy that algae eater from your local pet store, please do not dump it into your local river. There are places you can take it. I know that most of you, I wouldn't want to flush it down my toilet. So places like, we have a place called Discovery Center in San Marcos. It's a city facility, and they will take your fish that you no longer want. And they also adopt out fish. So it's kind of a rotating.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes, as you can imagine, these springs are clean, fresh water, lots of food, and these fish that get dumped in there, they survive very well, and then compete with other native species.
That's true for plants as well. So if you dump your aquaria plant, a lot of plants that we have in our systems got started because they're aquaria plants. Hydrilla, a great example.
Elephant ear, yeah.
Elephant ear.
So is it something where y'all work to remove the invasive species, and like y'all do a pretty decent job, but then people reintroduce like their aquatic plants and things? So it's kind of like a revolving thing that is always needing to be worked on then, right?
That's correct. It's just like your friend. It's just like your garden at your house. You can never quit.
Yes, yes.
And part of it too is, you can never get every little seedling or sprig. So even though you think you have every elephant ear out of a general area, or you have every bit of hygrophila cleaned out of a certain section, there's maybe that just one little fragment seed that has persisted.
They
and
grow
it
from
reestablishes.
rhizomes, or they grow beneath the sediment in the creek.
Correct.
And
so,
if you miss a single rhizome, a new plant comes out.
That's right. So
Absolutely.
we do a lot of our measures now are kind of in maintenance mode, where we've done a lot of the non-native work and gotten native species established and are now predominant. But there's always the gardening and the maintenance aspect that we're continuing on to make sure that those species don't kind of rear back and continue to establish.
That makes a lot of sense. And Melanie, Mark mentioned recreation, at least in the new channel, but in the San Marcos River, it's throughout the whole deal. So how do you contend with that?
Well, we do the work in the morning hours and off season.
And you have certain areas cordoned off, right?
Yes, for the Texas wild rice, we have certain areas that have a little rope around them. But the good news is that Texas wild rice hit a trigger. So at some certain density, it just went boom and has just spread.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah, so fast. It's shocked, I think, all of us. We had no idea this was going to happen. Having been told this was a fragile little plant.
Yeah, that's exciting.
It's
It's so pretty
exciting.
to see when you see, you're talking about the clear waters.
Yes.
When they take the photographs, it almost seems like you're in a different world, right?
It is beautiful.
It's so
It has a
pretty.
really bright green, Kelly green, just flowing in that blue, clear water. It is very beautiful. And so we have, we do cordon off certain areas just to make it a practice, a good practice that we keep going. But wild rice between Spring Lake Dam and I-35 is really almost everywhere. They're working very hard now. We have a biological goal to meet downstream of I-35. So we're working on planting that area. We obtained 2 federal grants. We leveraged the EAHCP funds to get those so we could go even further down to kind of solidify that effort for both riparian, in water, and then also spearfishing.
Wow. With the Texas wild rice, can you kind of explain for our listeners when the inception of the EAHCP, where were you all at as far as, I guess, quantifying the amount of Texas wild rice you had in the San Marcos River compared to now?
4,000. At the beginning, there were 4,000 square meters. We have a goal, biological cap goal of 15,000, and in the reach I just described from Spring Lake to I-35, we've blown that away.
You surpassed it. Nice, nice.
Yeah. So we have discovered, unfortunately, in Spring Lake, the habitat is just not suitable. We've tried many different places. We can get a little bit to grow, but then we lose it. It just doesn't thrive. So that will not reach its biological goal.
And are you talking about the Meadow Center area?
Correct.
Oh, wow. Because I'm you go on the glass bottom boat tours and you don't really see it.
Mm-mm. And it's a very different environment. It's very lake-like because of the dam. It does have the majority of the springs. It's got some great springs, but it just doesn't, it's kind of silty. It just doesn't work well for Texas wild rice.
I learned something new today.
I'm glad you mentioned those boats, because that is one way to kind of see that the springs actually coming up from the ground. They have one called Cream of Wheat Springs, and it looks like cream of wheat boiling under the water.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can see that and many other things. It's definitely worth a visit to Texas State to do that.
Texas State put a lot of money into the retrofit of Spring Lake for absolutely the benefit of the species. And, of course, the other side opposite the steep bank, so the left bank, all that was a parking lot. There was various buildings, a restaurant, lots of impervious cover. That, with an Army Corps of Engineers grant, was stripped and reverted to natural prairie.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
And then they built the wetland boardwalk, the viewing boardwalk with the interpretive signage. They've done a very nice job.
Yes, it's beautiful.
It really is. So, Mark and Melanie, how do you all believe partnerships and support from your cities have positively impacted the protection and conservation measures of the EAHCP?
I think partnerships are key. Definitely with getting the HCP in place and getting all the agreements with the various interest and partners is huge, and still being transparent and having all those partners involved is huge, and just continuing the HCP. But yeah, certainly, as far as partnering with volunteer organizations in New Braunfels or San Marcos, and Melanie could speak to that. But certainly doing river cleanups, partnering with agencies like the Headwaters at the Comal, to try to educate folks about the endangered species and the habitat conservation plan goes a long way. Certainly as the HCP progresses, there's folks that were involved in the early days that are slowly retiring, and council members that may have been involved in the early days of the HCP, and you have new council members coming on. So I think it's imperative just to continue the story of the HCP and the significance of the HCP in educating folks. And so through some of the partnerships that we have, we can continue to provide an outlet for education.
Definitely. Melanie, anything to add?
I would agree that we get our biggest support. HCP gets its biggest support from the community itself. The San Marcos River Foundation, the San Marcos Greenbelt Alliance, other local groups really believe in and help support. We've put on planting workshops and, of course, a myriad of litter cleanups and getting the community involved. For us, we have the university, which is a constantly changing, but we get so many volunteers. We love having the university in town. They're excited. They want to be involved.
They're
right?
Young. Students are like, you want to save the world, right?
Yes, it's wonderful. And so they come, they pick up litter, they grub through the dirt, and so it's just, that's been very helpful. And to echo Mark's point, because politics changes pretty rapidly, you really have to make an effort to keep them informed and aware.
I will definitely say that these rivers have become part of the culture of these two towns. It's ingrained in the citizens that live in these towns, that they have pride in those systems, and they definitely show it by participating in these cleanups and supporting the HCP. So you've definitely succeeded, at least at the community level for sure. Now here in San Antonio, the EAA is definitely trying to get citizens to understand the connection between what we do here and how that affects the quality of water coming out of the springs. So what we do here on the recharge zone eventually comes out of these springs. So if we're contaminating or littering on there, eventually it could affect, the springs as well. So I can see why collaboration is so important, because it's not a regional issue, or it's not an issue that only affects your two towns, but it's an issue that encapsulates this entire section of Texas. So it could not be done by one entity or just a couple of towns. It takes a myriad of partners and collaborations to make it work.
Absolutely.
Now, Melanie and Mark, in our previous podcast with our general manager, Roland Ruiz, we talked about the rollover of the incidental take permit, which is occurring in 2028, which is sooner than we realize as far as these things go. It comes quickly. So that's kind of bringing up the topic of what do you foresee as the future of the EAHCP moving into this new phase, this rollover period. So Melanie, let's start with you.
Well, we've been implementing this for 9 years, and we started off learning a lot of lessons fast. So we know, and we've accomplished a lot. And so I think we have a really distinct vision about what should be in the next ITP in regard to our specific systems. For example, we've been talking today a lot about the work that we've done and how we've rolled into maintenance mode. A lot of the invasives are gone. Yes, we have to keep them out, we have to maintain it, but it doesn't require the amount of time that we initially spent, both in the river and along the river. However, one thing in San Marcos, what we've seen, and in any system really, is that your seed source for the ligustrum, the Chinese tallow, the China berry, it comes obviously from upstream. Mm-hmm. And so the entire watershed needs to be looked at, and I think that needs to be the focus in the next ITP. Let's look at the watershed. Let's look at addressing seed sources. Let's look at addressing more water quality. We have addressed Sessom watershed, a portion of it, but we still need to look at the whole watershed, and then there's 3 other tributaries to look at. And so we need to take a bigger view, to put a more lasting fix on the changes that Mark and I have made in our systems.
Definitely. Mark?
Sure, I don't have too much to add. I'll echo that, definitely there's been a lot of lessons learned since the beginning, since we started implementing some of these habitat protection measures. And I know when the EAHCP was conceptualized and put together, there was assumptions made, and I think those were well-informed assumptions and some good thought that went into it. But certainly as you kind of get into implementing measures, some things work better than others, and so we've kind of had to adapt over the last 9 or so years. So we've learned a lot, and I think what we've learned will inform how we're going to kind of move into the next permit for the HCP or our next ITP permit. And then definitely agree with Melani on the looking at things from a watershed scale, whether you're managing invasive species or water quality. Any river system, well, at least these river systems, you definitely have the spring flow portion, which is a predominant amount of flow, but you also have the overland flow, the surface water portion, the stormwater runoff that enters these systems. They can have an impact on water quality in the endangered species. So looking to manage the contributing watershed areas, similar as you would kind of manage, the recharge zone of the Edwards Aquifer, and trying to make sure that the quality of water recharging is as good a quality as you can have. So you're minimizing pollutants, that discharge at the spring system. So, trying to reduce pollutant loading throughout the watershed to provide that water quality benefit in both spring systems is important.
And I know that one of your goals is for this next phase, this next ITP permit, is to have it be a longer-term permit. And you've basically proven that these partnerships work, that you're seeing improvement in both systems, and that you can have a permit for a longer period of time. Is that right?
That's correct. And that makes a lot of sense, because here we're just getting our feet wet, and it's about to be over, which is kind of amazing. And I think, however, it was a wise decision for this first ITP, because there's so much we didn't know, and there were so many uninformed judgments that were, understandably, that were made, that now, we know enough that a longer term makes more sense.
Well, Melani and Mark, thank you for taking the time to come down from your cities and share the successes of the HCP for the past decade. We look forward to having you all back in the future.
Thank you very much. We enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, y'all.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.